Good morning. Can everyone hear me fine? Yeah? It's just you're very, very far away. I've got my phone here so to check my timings because I see there's no clock and I don't want to ramble on forever. So remember to take that away. I will introduce myself a wee bit to say that how I conduct my research. I do statistical analysis of large-scale data sets. For example, the one I'm going to present to you today is the Growing Up in Scotland survey, which I'm sure many of you will be aware of. And what I also do, though, ever since beyond my days in Barnardo's, is I have worked longitudinally with the same families over time to explore their experiences, not only of poverty, but of welfare change over the last 8 to 10 years and how that has impacted on family finances, the family's ability to cope and family relationships and parental-child relationships. So I'll probably mention some of those types of analyses and experiences too, but on the whole it will be more of a presentation from Growing Up in Scotland data. What I would like to say, that little link at the front there is a briefing paper I wrote that has been quite well received in parliamentary circles and local authorities, and even as far as I was invited to the Department for Education at Westminster, because as you will see in the presentation, the politicians at Westminster love to shout about the poverty of aspirations and how are we going to raise children's aspirations without ever looking at what are their systems and processes that are in place and do they do anything to support children and families in the first place. So you may find that interesting. It's a live link if you get these slides and you can click on it and it should take you to that briefing paper if you'd like to know more about it. So to start off with, just to say I'm using Growing Up in Scotland data. It follows around 5,000 children in the particular birth cohort I'm using. These children were born in between 2004 and 2005. So they will now just be making those transitions to high school. This data takes a long time to come through and be cleaned, etc. So the children are about 8 years old at the time of the analysis that I'm going to show you. And it's going to be from birth to 8 years old. It's not a snapshot. I'm not telling you about when they're 8. I'm telling you about the circumstances from birth to 8. So the background to why I'm interested in the poverty of aspirations, or what I would call the so-called poverty of aspirations. And that is very much because in all the work I have done with families over the years, and when I have spoken to parents about what are your hopes for the future, what I find about parents living in poverty is their own hopes are very, very short term. As short term as the end of the week. You know, there's an event happening at the community centre at the end of the week. If I can save enough money back to go to the tea club at the end of the week, then I'd really like that. So to try and get people to see much further for themselves, for parents for themselves, was quite difficult. And then I'd say, what about your children? What are your future hopes for your children? And without fail, every parent I'd ever known, even the parents who were engaged with Barnardo services because they were dealing with some difficult circumstances at home, what you may now call adverse childhood circumstances, even those parents, without exception, had high hopes and aspirations within their own understanding of what was possible. They had high hopes and aspirations for their children. And so with that in mind, when this new data set came through that for the first time Growing Up in Scotland was actually speaking to children about when they were 7 or 8, they were getting to fill in a questionnaire about themselves for the first time. Until that point it had been the main carer, 97% of which was the mum, or the mother figure, female anyway. And so for the first time children were responding, and I looked at that data and looked at the parents' data on their experiences of school and their hopes and aspirations for their children's future. So aspirations have become a key policy driver, and in the UK, but also beyond the UK. It's seen as critical for closing the attainment gap and improving the attainment and raising the skills of all children and young people. And within this framework, it's very much a deficit model in that parents and their children are seen as somehow lacking aspirations and that there's a gap there that we need to fill. And it holds young parents, whether it means to or not, it puts a responsibility onto young people and their parents to either gain some or raise their aspirations. And by doing this, well, I'll come on to that, but when you speak to young people and their aspirations, you find, and young people and parents about their aspirations, what you find is that they have perhaps constraints within what they would wish for their children or for themselves, because they can only aspire to what is familiar to them, what they know from their communities, what are the standard types of jobs, how did people used to get those jobs when I was young. You went to FE college, you did an apprenticeship, etc. So often their aspirations may be at that level, rather than the desire necessarily to go to university. But what I would like to show you is how pervasive this type of language is. I could easily have stood here and done a presentation on my work on poverty, and some of the themes would be exactly the same. The themes of what comes from government, and when I say government, I'm not talking about the very thoughtful civil servants, I'm actually talking about the politicians, about what comes from government unthinkingly, what they say and what they say to media, what media then reports unthinkingly, which is always a deficit model of families and behavioural aspects of families, and individualises the problems of poverty. And it's the same with the poverty of aspirations. These are just some newspaper articles. So that we have a poverty of aspiration, not a poverty of talent, from The Spectator. And then David Cameron said, fighting poverty is no less about aspiration than cutting inheritance tax. That's a strange one on me. Theresa May said, poverty is not just about income, it's about aspiration. I will go on, but when think about that statement, it's not just about income, it's about aspiration. Now, if you say that poverty is not about income and that it's about what families do or what families know or what families can't do or how their behaviours are not conducive to creating the optimum conditions for their children to learn, if you say it's not about income, then you create the conditions as a government where you will find support in the public for cutting people's income. And that is precisely what we have seen since 2010. We have seen £37 billion worth of cuts to families and to services helping families. So this is very conditioning type of language if you continue to say this. Then David Cameron had a nifty little aspiration nation, because, you know, it rhymes and is simple. Yeah, I like that one. And poverty of aspiration is what is keeping people poor. So it's not the fact that they've cut people's money, it's not the fact that lone parents are now £2,400 a year worse off, it's because they don't aspire. And this is not even about the Conservative government, unfortunately. Tony Blair was one of the first to say this. Their poverty is not just about poverty of income, but poverty of aspiration. And so he started it. Gordon Brown, also said, it's low aspirations that hold us back. This phrase again, poverty of aspiration, is as damaging as poverty of opportunity. At least he didn't say it's as damaging as having absolutely no money, which is kind of what the Conservatives are saying. So we think, well, we've got the Scottish Parliament now, we've got the Scottish Government now. This is from the transcript, the official transcript of Stage 3 debate of the Child Poverty Bill, which was ratified in December 2017. You'll know we now have the Child Poverty Act in Scotland. But even during that debate, we had one of the MSPs saying, and this is a Lib Dem MSP, saying there is a poverty of aspiration. And I thought, oh, is there? Okay, this is in the Child Poverty Act discussion and debate. I really thought in Scotland we'd come away from that type of deficit model of debate and discussion. And then the Conservative Michelle Ballantyne said, he's hit the right note. And I thought, I wish I was there and stood up and said, really? Tell me how? Where's your evidence? Because I'll show you my evidence. And then thankfully someone said, can we just take a pause and say that's actually a really offensive term to accuse people of having poverty of aspirations. And it was on the back of this, I was already speaking in this field when a few civil servants who knew about my work said to me, is there any chance you could get a briefing paper out on this using your evidence so we can start to actually use this with government and policymakers? And that's where this work has led me to. So to just say that children living in poverty do have high aspirations. Often their aspirations are of a very gendered variety when they're living in poverty. So we will see girls saying that they want to be hairdressers, and you will hear boys maybe saying they want to be what we would have seen traditionally as boys' jobs. But then if you go to any deprived neighbourhood and you see that it's full of bookies and hairdressers and charity shops, then, you know, hairdressers never out of a job really, are they? We all need to get our hair cut. So often what you find is that their aspirations may be constrained. They may not seem very highfalutin compared to what we may consider an aspiration to be. It's not a free choice they have of aspirations because they lack the knowledge. But furthermore, they don't start off with low expectations. If you do any work with children in primary schools, you will see very much that they aspire across the board, probably the same as all the other children in the class. Perhaps at that age it gets a little bit overblown. I want to be an astronaut. I want to be this, that, the next thing. You know, I want to go on X Factor. I want to be really rich. I want to be Simon Cowell. That type of thing. But the confidence at that age is there, and the desire to do something exciting and different is there. And that is what becomes diminished over time. And it's a point I'll come back to at the end. Let's check my time. So what we find is aspirations become attenuated over time. They diminish, they are not supported, they are not strengthened. Children lose confidence throughout their teenage years. They lose self-efficacy, self-esteem, and aspirations necessarily then. And they may become reduced, but they did not start off that way, and they still hold aspirations for themselves. So the missing element is knowledge. And parents also have high aspirations, but they feel very much unable to engage fully with secondary education. Parents are living in poverty are likely, remember this is just are likely to, we're not talking about every single person, are likely to have had negative experiences of education themselves. They're likely to be abjectly terrified of a head teacher. I don't know if you're aware, you're a scary bunch. You know, teachers and head teachers, but you are. They're likely to be really nervous and quite terrified. And they feel inadequate of their own knowledge and their competence to help their children in their work. Let me come on to teachers, because teachers and student teachers, now I teach student teachers and I've been a teacher, have little understanding of the link between child poverty and educational attainment. In Scotland, I'm pleased that there are at least a lot of initiatives to help practitioners understand what is causing poverty, and that it's not because parents are rubbish with money that they're poor, it's because government processes and structures are making people live in poverty and increasing levels of poverty. Child poverty is increasing at an amazing rate between now and 2021, 2022 across the UK because of government policy. In the new Labour years, almost 1 million children were lifted out of poverty. They had very successful policies that did a lot of good work for families. That has been completely reversed, and the situation's become quite dire. We're looking at approaching the projections that we will have about 40% of children living in poverty if the current policy situation does not change. In Scotland, the new Social Security Act, the new Child Poverty Act are very much trying to mitigate against some of the more negative impacts of Westminster policy, but there's only so much they can do when they don't have control over the greater processes and structures. So you're going to listen to me for a wee while and think I'm beating up on teachers, but I come good again, I promise. So teachers do not necessarily understand this. I know when I was a teacher, I did not get any training on poverty itself. And I speak to lots of other academics who train teachers now, and they say they don't get anything as standard. They get equalities, but they don't get poverty. And maybe they do an hour a year for them. And I've just been invited, I'm at Stirling University now, and I've been asked to come and do an hour with the trainee teachers on poverty, just a sort of one group. That's not sufficient. That's why people are having to go through CPD right now with the 1 in 5 in Edinburgh, what they're doing in Glasgow, because the training that you have received in poverty is not sufficient. And because it's not sufficient, you are subject to the same type of barrage of information from the media as the rest of us. If you don't understand what the structures are that are causing poverty, then you're going to be subject to the same pathologising stories about families and their ineptitude and how their behaviours and what they're doing for their children is not good enough. And you'll see people as feckless and undeserving unless we get really good training in place about poverty and its impacts on education. When we have negative stereotypes of families, or when we unconsciously, because I don't for a minute think anyone consciously thinks negative thoughts about families, but this unconscious bias we have towards certain types of families who display certain types of behaviours actually only serves to perpetuate inequality, because children are very attuned to how they are being responded to in the classroom setting. And if they think for 1 minute that anyone's looking down on them and their families, they're not going to engage. So let's look at poverty in Scotland. You can see that this is a relative poverty rate. They've changed the way they're running the statistics. They're doing 3-year averages because it's more robust than trying to give you an annual snapshot. So the last 3-year average there is between 2014 to 2017. And there's an uptick, as you can see, of poverty in Scotland, that it's now 24% of children in Scotland living in poverty. So what was the 1 in 5 project in Edinburgh is already really 1 in 4. So we're starting to see that level of increase in just a few years. When we combine it with material deprivation, we can see that that is also on an upswing. In-work poverty is massive. So when the government emphasises, I have real problems with this idea of employability. I don't know how much that type of discourse is filtered into schools about making young people employable. It's filtered into universities. It's now my job. When I write a course description for teaching students, I'm not just teaching them substantive knowledge. I need to teach about what am I doing to make my students employable. And the notion of employability as regards poverty really I find quite galling, because it's now almost 70% of children living in poverty in the UK are living in a family where someone is working. So it's not absence of employment that's causing poverty in the UK. It's low quality, insecure employment with insufficient hours, where people are underemployed, can't get the hours they want, and that's a real struggle. The recent analysis was if you have a couple parent both working in minimum wage jobs, or what they've called the national living wage, the national living wage jobs for a couple will not be enough to get those children properly out of poverty in a good standard for their family, and that would be 2 full-time adults working in a household. What I also want to talk a wee bit about poverty is that people assume the same group of people are in poverty over time. So when we say 20% of children are in poverty, 25% of children are in poverty, and each year everyone thinks it's the same group of people who are in poverty. If you even go back to Tony Blair's comment of their poverty, I would love to have said to Tony, whose poverty? Who are you talking about? Because looking at this from growing up in Scotland over the first 7 or 8 years of a child's life, there is only 45% of children who have not experienced poverty. People go in and out of poverty all the time. And as a massive group manages to leave, another group falls into it. It is a different population that is cycling into and out of poverty over time. It's not the same people. And furthermore, you won't necessarily know who's in poverty in your school, because parents mask and children mask their poverty. They deliberately go to extreme lengths to hide the fact that they may be struggling through stigma, through pride, but also through fear of service intervention. When people are using food banks, there was a real lack of people using food banks for children at one point. And this was quite interesting, as in why are they not asking for stuff for children? And the reason was that in the earlier days of food banks, there was an absolute fear from mothers and parents, but usually mothers, to ask a food bank for food for their children, for fear that that would bring on unwanted service intervention of you can't feed your bairns, you might get your bairns taken off you. So think of the fear that gets put in people's mind too. So what's the message from that is that poverty is very much dynamic. There are not a fixed population. You might not know who they are necessarily. Now I'm going to talk about the poverty of aspirations. And this is a graph from the children's data of growing up in Scotland. If you look, I have divided people into whether they're living in persistent poverty, that is whether they've been in poverty at least 4 years of the period, whether they're in transient poverty, which is maybe just a one-off occurrence, whether they're in recurrent poverty, as in whether they're dipping in and out over time, and whether they've never been poor at all. And these are children, so they're still primary age children. These are their experiences of school. And they're being asked, how much do you like it when your teacher asks you to tell people about what you've been doing in the class? And how much do you enjoy learning at school? And do you hate school or do you love school? And as you can see, there is no difference. There is no statistical difference, but I think the graph very much shows there is no difference in children's experience of school based on poverty in primary school age. School is very important to children, and on the whole, children really enjoy school. What it doesn't tell you, though, what that's not going to tell you is it may be that those children have different abilities to respond to what you require of them in the classroom. That may not be equal. Their ability to engage and participate may not be equal. They may not have your language and your mode of communication as middle-class people, but what they do have is a real willingness to be there and a happiness to be there. So this was parental aspirations for their children. And what I haven't gone on about actually earlier is what do we even mean by high aspirations, because that varies by who you are too. If you look at secondary schools, their idea of a high aspiration is usually access to the professions. It's usually going to university. The government documents, both at the Westminster and the Scottish Government levels, think of a high aspiration as being an apprenticeship, going into further education college, going into university, and going into a training programme. They see all of that as a high aspiration. A positive destination is probably is the language they use. If it's a positive destination, it's a high aspiration. And that's the language of government. But that's not the language of schools. So we're not even talking about the same thing when we're talking about high aspirations, which is quite interesting. But for parents, staying on at school to go on to university, leaving school to go to college and FE college, and leaving school to start a training course or an apprenticeship. And once again, you can tell there are very slight differences among parents living in poverty and what they want for their children. Even of the poorest parents, the persistent poverty, you're looking at 75% wanting them to stay on at school and go on to university, compared to around 88%. So statistically there is a slight difference, but that difference is not massive. It's not huge. What the data also show, but I'm not going to keep showing you graphs, I don't want to give you death by graphs, is that and parents are less likely to believe that they can positively influence their children's achievement at school. Now these were primary school age children, and parents were being asked, how able do you feel to influence your child's education? How able do you feel to help with their homework? How confident do you feel? And there was still a proportion of parents at the primary level saying, I don't feel confident to help my child with their schoolwork. So you can now extrapolate that to the secondary level, and you can understand for a lot of parents, they do not feel they have the knowledge, the skills, the capabilities to help. So the problem with the poverty of aspirations as a concept is that it is not supported by research evidence, and that will go from 20 years of my qualitative research work with families to analysis of this data. And I can present you with a paper from Australia that says the same thing. I can present you with an analysis of data from England that is going to tell you the same thing, that there is not a lack of aspirations among families. Okay? If we assume this, if we continue along this idea that families lack aspirations for their children, we are passing that responsibility from government and from local authorities and even from schools onto parents and onto children. And in fact, what it also disadvantages teachers, because if they're not fully understanding the causes of poverty, the risk factors for poverty, the impacts of poverty, its effects on children and their education, if they're listening to politicians and the media, and where else do we get our information from if not the media via politicians, if we believe that without giving it some critical appraisal, without thinking critically about what we're being told and whether it is supported by the evidence, then as teachers, we believe that the poverty of aspirations is a fact. If you believe it's a fact, you're going to try and fix the wrong thing. You're going to throw your resources at something which is different to what you're actually conceiving it to be. Okay? So it's problematic for teachers. They're being asked to fix something that doesn't exist as it's being presented to them. So teachers are actually tasked with solving a problem which is completely misrepresented to them. So schools and policymakers are putting effort into raising aspirations. Instead, it's not likely to narrow the educational gap, I'm afraid, because it's based on false assumptions. The real challenge for disadvantaged young people and their parents is not about holding an aspiration as in aspiring to something. It's about sustaining aspirations over time. It's about supporting young people and their families in trying to maintain confidence, self-esteem, self-efficacy through those teenage years so that they don't lose the aspirations they had, that they don't start to think, I am not capable of this, I can't do this. And it's about giving them the ideas, the information that's out there in the first place. I think I've pretty much said all that, but this is the analogy I came up with. Those of you who know me just know I love an analogy. And this analogy, I didn't pluck this out of thin air, actually. I was chatting to someone who's exceptionally wealthy, and I said, oh, what are you up to? What are you doing? They said, yeah, I'm, I've got my parents' place in Saint-Tropez, so I'm looking for a yacht to keep down there. I was like, all right, okay, you're going for a yacht in Saint-Tropez. And I had to think about it, and it really brought me down to aspirations, because I thought, well, he's aspiring to this yacht in Saint-Tropez, but more than aspiring to it, he's about to buy a yacht in the Mediterranean for sailing in Saint-Tropez. And I thought, well, who aspires to that? I thought, I don't think there's one person in this room who's aspiring to yacht ownership on the Côte d'Azur. I'm assuming not. I really don't think so. I bet there's not one person in the room that even thought of that as an aspiration, as something you could have if you worked hard enough. I don't think it's on your list of things that you might like for yourself in life. I really don't think it is. I could be wrong. And that's because I'm guessing that you haven't been sailing with extremely rich people in Saint-Tropez. I'm guessing that's the fact. I could be wrong, but I'm guessing that's probably the case. If you have never been sailing with extremely rich people in Saint-Tropez, would you aspire to yacht ownership on the Côte d'Azur? And my guess is that no, you would not. And this is kind of the point I'm trying to make with young people and families. If they do not know what is available to them and what is attainable and achievable, and if they do not know the path and are not guided along the path and sustained on the path to attain this, and have their abilities strengthened, but also their confidence built, then they're not going to reach any of their aspirations. And I had a conversation, I've done a presentation similar to this, I had this conversation when I was talking about how sometimes teachers attenuate children's aspirations because they think they're being kind. And I've actually had a teacher say to me, oh, I know what you mean, because I had this child saying to me they wanted to be a doctor, and I had to say to them, look, you're not going to be a doctor, And I said, why can't that child aspire to be a doctor? Why can't they be helped to research the medical profession? If they don't get the grades to be a doctor, they may have become a radiologist. They may have become some other. The medical professions are yay wide, Go down that route and see where it takes you. You may change your mind anyway. But what you don't do is, at the age of 12 or 14, think, your maths is a bit shonky. You're not going to be a doctor, okay? And this is still happening. I am speaking to people on an almost daily basis. I am still speaking to student teachers who are in staff rooms, listening to how families are being portrayed. And I've been a teacher, I've sat in staff rooms, I know how families are portrayed. So these were really recommendations for the policymakers to understand what is available and understand what is a high aspiration, that it's okay to go to FE college. Do you know the number of people I support into university, and the number of people who do not know that you can get into university with an HNC or an HND or an access course, and that we actually support people. We have wine and participation things at universities where we support people from non-standard routes into university. I had a kid after their hires crying to me saying, my life is over. I did not get the hires to get into university. And that is what children in 5th year think. They think if they don't get those hires, their life is over. I've heard that on multiple occasions. I've got 3 vaguely teenagers myself. One's 24, but seriously still a teenager. So I keep calling them the sort of teenagers, even though they're getting beyond that. And we mustn't let children think they've been written off because they've got 4 C's and a B at higher, because 4 C's and a B's will probably not get you into the type of university course you want to go to. But then it will get them into further education course where maturity and application can mean that they'll do something in HNC and HND that can then get them into university. And university is not the be all and end all, okay, I'm not saying it is, but there are multiple routes into these ways of thinking. So this is an exercise I did with teachers. I'm going to check my time because I have to finish by 15:15 and leave you 5 minutes for questions or so. I did this exercise with teachers. And I'm not going to do it with you, there's far too many of you. And I call it flipping the thinking. Because a teacher once asked me, even after I do all these things about poverty, teacher came up and said, how do I teach those children living in poverty to value their education? And I just want to drop on the floor and kick my legs and scream. But I didn't. So I said to her, well, what do you do to show these children that you value them in your classroom, to make them want to take up your offer of education? How are you showing children living in poverty that you respect them, that they're valued in your classroom, that you understand some of their life, and if you don't understand it, you're not judging it? How do you keep it, if not, there's 3 things here. There's either stigma, the absence of stigma, which to me is neutral, or there's the presence of a positive, which is promoting some dignity and respect and trying to really push forward for these children to draw them into your world. The world of education is extremely middle class. We are all in education because it worked for us. You will all know people at school, really bright people, for whom education did not work for them. Okay, so we're expecting a 5-year-old to come into the school and understand our way of communicating. And for middle classes who reflect, other middle class parents reflect how we communicate with our children. So the middle class children come in completely au fait with how we're communicating with them. And children living in poverty have probably had completely different types of engagements and ways of, and maybe more people speak to them in different ways, etc. They will have a different mode of communication at that stage. So they're having to learn a whole new thing that is called education. And some time needs to be thought about that. So I would say, instead of expecting stressed children to understand the long-term value of education, to be quite ponderous and say, yes, that'd be lovely, thank you, I would like to come to your extra maths class. How do we flip the thinking and put the onus back on people who have a greater intellectual capacity and experience to show the children that they are valued in their classroom? So this was one of the questions I did with this group. The next question is exactly what I just said, is that there's a lot of work being done in schools, which is great, to reduce and eliminate poverty-related stigma and shame. The Poverty Alliance have a massive campaign called Stick Your Labels, whereas we're trying to say, get rid of the stigma, But to me, that's not enough. It's a neutral act. That's like, stop hitting someone, stop being bad. That's not enough. It's neutral. It's nothing. I think we need to turn it. We need to flip it. Let's put it into the presence of a positive. Rather than reduce or eliminate stigma, how do we actively promote relationships, dignity, respect, communication, and appreciate the difficulties that poverty puts in the way of children coming to school. The children who won't come to school on PE day because they don't have a PE kit. You know, it's not rocket science. The girls who are off school because they've got their period. You know, I would love, and I know some people have done it, have tracked girls' absences on their system to see if there's a pattern, and there's a monthly pattern. So that was the next question, is what can you do to promote dignity and respect for those who are still coming to school each day despite the barriers that poverty put in their way? And I could have done a whole session on just the barriers that poverty put in your way, but this was what I was asked to do today. And the feedback evaluation, because even after you do all this, sometimes it just does, the penny doesn't drop. I'm beginning to think I should just stop speaking publicly, because the penny sometimes does not drop, because even after that, this was evaluation feedback, and I was asking them to address those two questions I've just put to you, and it said, yeah, but the group discussion went on tangent, and we ended up talking about the conversations about parental controls and parental values. I thought, are you having a laugh? Did you not read the questions? Are you teachers? Can't you follow the instructions? You know the first rule of exams is answer the question, which I tell my students twice a year, every year, answer the question. Don't write me a random essay on something you know about. That's not what I've asked you to do. Give me 1,500 words on anything you happen to have read recently, which they do. It's like, answer that question, only that question. So even then, the question wasn't answered, and I really did want to stamp my feet that day. But I'm no foot stamping today. Hopefully I haven't just gone on a massive rant, but what I would like to say is just understand that the things you may have taken for granted, challenge that thinking, apply a critical lens. If there's one thing I could say about government policy, is that it causes what we always thought may be unintentional stigma, okay, and unintentional consequences for family. The type of policies that have been enacted from the Westminster government since 2010 are strongly looking towards intentional stigma, because stigma is a tool. When people feel stigmatised, they don't take up benefits, they don't take up your free school meals, they don't take up your school clothing grants if it's delivered in a stigmatising way. And so education's done wonderful things to make that non-stigmatising with the card system, and now people getting money rather than vouchers for school clothing grants. But at the government level, at the Westminster government level, stigma is still being used as a tool to beat families living in poverty. So we need to apply a critical lens to support the families to overcome the barriers that are actually getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And I think I have actually managed to leave you 5 minutes for questions. Thank you.